Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alexander Rufus Isaacs. I am a vice president of the Beverly Hills Bar Association, which is co-presenting today's program with Writers Bloc Presents. The Beverly Hills Bar was founded in 1931 because of the prejudice suffered against Jewish lawyers in Los Angeles at the time, and has been a leading advocate for civil rights, social justice, and the rule of law ever since. This background makes us especially pleased to be co-presenting today's program because Ratline focuses on such important issues. We also enjoy putting on programs such as this, which are of interest to non-lawyers as well as lawyers. You can find out more about us at bhba.org. I'm delighted to be working on another program with Writers Bloc, whose events I've been attending for many years. All Writers Blockers know and love Andrea Grotzman. She is more than our founder and our CEO, whatever our official title is. She is the heart and soul of Writers Bloc, who manages to combine erudition and humor, crowd pulling and integrity, and juggling a million tasks and relationships, while also exuding an ineffable calmness and ability to make time for everyone. The first event I worked on with Andrea is very fitting for today's program. In 1998, we managed to persuade the great John Mortimer, English barrister, bon vivant, and author of the Rumpole of the Bailey series, to forsake the Chilterns for the Beverlys for a few days. And I well remember his talk at the Skirball Center, which included a memorable description of the most unbiblical activities that certain members of Her Majesty's judiciary are alleged to have engaged in, I think much to the shock of much of the audience. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Andrea to introduce today's program, but before doing so, I want to express my deep admiration for Philippe's professional achievements and the great pleasure that I have taken in reading Ratline. Last but not least, as a keen detectorist, I want to say to Rebecca how much I enjoyed her marvelous New Yorker article on the Viking Horde. And with that, I will hand the baton to Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks, Zan, for suggesting we do this together. And thank you so much to Philippe, Rebecca, and later to Stephen Fry, as well as to our audience all over the world. Philippe Sands weaves personal family history, investigative journalism, and the exploits of unimaginable Nazi evil to form a jaw-dropping new book, The Ratline. Philippe's exploration into the life and death of a Nazi Führer, Otto Wachter, becomes personal between this high-ranking Nazi officer, his maddeningly disbelieving son, and Philippe himself, an internationally renowned human rights lawyer. It is Otto Wachter, not really a household name now, who caused Philippe's family and many of our own untold suffering and death. What's so remarkable is Philippe's intimate portrait of Otto's family life, as tracked through thousands of pages of letters between Otto and his wife, photos and diary entries. What we discover is raw and bloodthirsty ambition, utterly dismissive of any human toll. You'll have to decide who's more horrifying and vile, Otto Wachter or his wife. Can anything still surprise us from our perch on the other side of the history? Yes. Philippe offers another witness to Wachter's life, that of his confoundingly genial son, Horst, who is still alive. And Horst, who lives in a rundown castle in Austria, just can't believe all the terrible things everyone has to say about his father. It's riveting. Rebecca Mead knows how to write riveting history too. A longtime columnist for The New Yorker, she often writes on the intersection of history and contemporary life, whether exploring Viking treasure hunters or buried cemeteries in London or the eternal truth of Middlemarch. Rebecca, like Philippe, makes history close enough to touch. So if Philippe and Rebecca weren't enough of an embarrassment of riches, acclaimed actor and writer Stephen Fry will join us in a bit. Stephen is the reader on the audiobook and has insights on Philippe's journey with the Ratline. We know you'll have questions. Feel free to email them to us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com. That's writersblock with a C, presents.com, and we'll try to address them. make sure you visit writersblockprevents.com to get a link to buy the Ratline. It's just thrilling. Thank you so much. And I'm so delighted to present Philippe Sands and Rebecca Mead.
Thank you. That was really a lovely introduction for both of us. And I am so delighted to be here, to be able to ask Philippe some questions about the book and to pretend to be in Los Angeles, even though both of us are in London on opposite sides of Hampstead Heath as we speak. So hi, Philippe, great to see you.
Hi, Rebecca. It's really lovely to be here. And I just join you. Thanks to Jean and Andrea. It's really lovely to be in LA. Lovely.
So Philippe, tell us, how did the journey of the Ratline begin?
Well, I won't give you the whole story because it's a very long and convoluted one. It sort of started with an invitation to give a lecture in an obscure Ukrainian city called Lviv. Anyway, one thing led to another. And I started writing a book which became East-West Street, which is a sort of prequel to the Ratline. And in doing that, I came to know a man called Nicholas Frank, who was the son of Hans Frank. Now, Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer and was then Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. And he became the fourth character in East-West Street. And he was hanged at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity and war crimes, an absolutely terrible individual. And at a certain point, his son, who is a wonderful man, Nicholas Frank, who despises his father and his father's crime, said to me, Philippe, you're interested in the city of Lemberg, Lviv. It's where my grandfather was from, Leon Buchholz. He's one of the characters in East-West Street. Would you like to meet the son of the governor of Lemberg, Lviv, District Galicia? The governor was my father's deputy, Otto Wachter, he said, and he has a son called Horst, and it's a curiosity that many of the children of high-ranking Nazis stay in touch with each other. Would you like to meet Horst? One thing led to another. I wrote a profile of Horst in the Financial Times. Unlike Nicholas, Horst sort of he loves his mother, and through his mother sort of loves his father and tries to find the good in his father and denies that his dad's a criminal. I wrote a profile in the Financial Times. We then made a film together for the BBC, My Nazi Legacy, which you can get on all the usual, sort of Amazons and iTunes and so on and so forth. And at a certain moment in the filming, since we're in LA filming as I suppose relevant, Nicholas said he thought Horst might be a new type of Nazi, which I disagreed with and said so. And Horst was so upset that he said to me, how can I prove I'm not a Nazi? What can I do? And Horst is not a Nazi. He's not an anti-Semite. He's not a Holocaust denier. He just thinks his dad is a good bloke, which he's not. And I thought about this question, and Jean and others from the Bar Association will know proving a negative is always fraught with difficulty. But I came up with this brilliant idea, I thought, of what you've got all these family documents that you haven't really shown me, thousands of pages, 9,000 pages of letters between his mother and father, all their diaries, everything. Why don't you give it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? Because Nazis don't tend to give that kind of material away. It's a brilliant idea. Would you like a copy? And therein begins.
Mm-hmm. So you knew that he had this material somewhere hidden in his schloss. Had you seen it?
Well,
and if you knew it was there, had you not asked for it?
Well, I would say things like, I'm interested in what happened in Lemberg on the 1st of August, 1942. And he'd go off to another of the 100 rooms, all unheated, living in total poverty. And he'd come back with his mum's diary for 1942. And he'd say, look, here it is. And I'd go, he said, what date do you want? And I'd say, well, 1st of August, 1942, Hans Frank comes to Lemberg and he announces the extermination of the entire Jewish population with Otto Wachter present. Let's see what's in her diary on the 1st of August, 1942. And Horst goes and gets the diary and comes back and shows me that page. I don't have all the rest. And it says, Frank arrived. They went off and did work and did speeches. I don't know anything about that. And then he came home. We played chess 3 times. I won twice. He was very irritated, left early in a huff. And that was the kind of material that it was. It was the mundanity next to the mass murder. And I had seen many of the photographs that he had showed me, and some of the letters, and a page or two of the diaries, but that was it. I'd never seen the whole thing.
Right. What do you think he was doing by just hanging on to them and keeping them in this attic room or wherever they were? I mean, what do you know what he'd ever planned to do with them? Did he want to write something himself? Did he just want to hold them in case someone one day came along who would, he thought, uh, exonerate his father?
Well, I think he hoped. I don't think he was going to write a book. I think he hoped that somehow this material would prove the decency of Papa, and he wasn't intending to do anything with it, because I think he was sort of oblivious to quite what he was sitting on. So that the Schloss is an amazing place, and any of you who are watching, frankly, if you write to him and say, I'd like to come and visit, we've read the Ratline, he'll invite you and he'll give you tea and he'll really be happy to meet you. So the top floor is the library, which is divided into sections. And one section was the Third Reich section. So we went ambling off into the Third Reich section. And I remember there's one moment early on in about 2012, I just put my hand in, picked out a black volume, opened it, and I just thought, oh my God. And it was a copy of Mein Kampf, inscribed by his mother to his father, in celebration of our joint struggle. This was before they got married. And then I put my hand in and picked out another one, and it was, again, another black volume, swastika on the front, and it was a birthday gift, summer of 1944, Heinrich Himmler to Otto Wachter, and a long inscription from Himmler on the inside. And Horst rather sweetly said, oh, I didn't know I had that. That's wonderful. So he was sort of oblivious to what he was sitting on.
When you opened up the material and fortunately got it digitized by the Holocaust Museum and were able to pore over it and see what was there, I mean, as a reader reading through the material, what is so striking is that both Otto and his wife Charlotte were not just Nazis, and Otto wasn't just a mass murderer, but he was also just kind of a terrible high society person as well. I mean, the detail of their obliviously charmed lives is really astonishing. Can you talk a little bit about
it is astonishing. I mean, it's very problematic. It's also a love story, and this is problematic because I don't depict Otto Wachter or Charlotte, who was absolutely complicit in everything he did, as monsters. They weren't monsters. They did monstrous things, he in particular, and she supported him completely. But they were also capable of humanity and generosity and love and affection. And of course, that's the big complexity of that period and any period of horror and mass murder. How do highly intelligent, cultured, reasonable, decent, religious folk get embroiled in mass murder? And it was the mundanity of their lives. I mean, they're both highly intelligent, both pretty gorgeous looking human beings, both, involved with other people from time to time. And it for me, what was fascinating was understanding how lines were crossed, how it was that you crossed a little line early on and actually the skies didn't tumble, and then you could cross another line and hey, things still didn't get disastrous. And at the end of the day, you're murdering hundreds of thousands of people and you've just slipped into the horror. And I think that is slightly relevant for our times because the events of the 6th of January in the United States, in the Capitol, indicate to us how one thing leads to another. And I think that is their story. But interspersed with the horror, which is, of course, almost all cut out of the private materials. I did find that, I think it's probably been partly filleted, but I did find some juicy horror tidbits, is just the mundanity of their extraordinary lives. I mean, going to the opera with Himmler and Hitler, sitting in the Gauleiter's box at the Salzburg Festival, going to Leni Riefenstahl's opening night gala. It's going to be very familiar to a lot of readers.
Or helping yourself to art from the museum, and having things just around the place that you like, that belong to the nation.
I mean, one of the documents that I came across, it took a long time. It took 5 years of research, and I worked with an extraordinary group of my graduate students Polish, Ukrainian, German, Austrian, extraordinary young people, because all the materials in German. So it was a huge, huge exercise. But we would chase things. So we came across, for example, an extraordinary affidavit written in 1946 by the director of the main art museum of Krakow, where, I mean, Wächter was the governor of Krakow. He built the Krakow ghetto. This is a top table Nazi, personally appointed by Hitler. 5th of December 1939, says the affidavit. The governor's wife, a brunette lady named Charlotte Wächter, arrived at the museum with a note from her husband saying she could take anything she wanted. And in the list of paintings that were taken, it's an, Dürer, a Bruegel, I mean, just extraordinary to hang at home. And some of that art was then disappeared. And Horst then would say to me very gently, well, of course, we were 6 children, and every time one of us got married, mother would give us a gift. And it was an artwork from that period. So it goes on into the next generations.
To what extent do you think Horst's devotion to the memory of his father is really a devotion to the lived experience with his mother, whom he with whom he did spend his childhood, whereas his father was a remote figure whom he really didn't know, and his mother lived quite late, didn't she? And he remained very involved with her. So to what extent do you think that it's a fidelity of the son to the mother as much as to the father?
That's exactly what it is. Horst was born in 39, so he's now 80, 81, 82 years old. Otto died in 1949. He was on the run, indicted for mass murder, genocide, crimes against humanity. He dies in the arms of a Vatican bishop. We can come and say a little bit more about that later, in very mysterious circumstances, trying to get onto the Ratline, following the path of Mengele, Eichmann, and Priebke, and Haas, and others. But he never makes it, and he dies in this slightly mysterious way. Charlotte lives on until 1985. In fact, Horst's wife, Jacqueline, who was Swedish and was lovely, she's unfortunately passed away. At one point, I think it was on my second visit, she took me to one side just before I was leaving and said, Philippe, you have to understand that that Charlotte was a Nazi until the day she died. And Horst loved his mother despite that. And his mother loved him. He was the chosen one amongst the 6 children to take the story forward. And he, I think, he loves his mother deeply. And he will say, I didn't really know my father, but because my mother loved my father, my duty as a son is to find the good in my mother. His relationship with Charlotte was so close that for many years he would have 2 suppers every evening. He'd have a first supper with Charlotte, and then he'd go home and have supper with Jacqueline, and Jacqueline couldn't bear it, and she divorced him. And then the day after Charlotte died, they got back together, and they then got remarried. So it says a lot about the nature of that family.
Yeah. I mean, Horst is such an extraordinary character in himself, isn't he? I mean, he's someone that throughout the process of making first the documentary and then the podcast and then finally the book, you have this kind of dance backwards and forwards with him. I wonder how he has responded to the book and where you are in your own feelings now about Horst. And yeah.
Well, I mean, I think of Horst. There's a scene in the film, the My Nazi Legacy film, where he describes his birthday in April 1945. He's 6 years old, and he describes that the end of the war is coming, the collapse, as Charlotte called it. And he describes the British and American bombers flying overhead. And as he's telling the story, he starts crying. And it was that moment, early in our relationship, it was about 2013, that I realized that in his own way, Horst is a victim of that period. He's a damaged person. He's like a child struggling to reconstitute a life that was lost, the idyll of family life, of wealth, of specialness. And that, once you see it in that context, it becomes easier to see that he's not a bad person, and that is one of the reasons I feel quite protective towards him. And he, in a sense, he likes me. We get on. Every time we did something, the article in the FT, the film, the podcast on the BBC, also called the Ratline, he would sort of sever relations and then come back. And so with the book, there's sort of been a welter of emails. He sort of copies me in, inadvertently or not, to the emails to all and sundry. And the book is schrecklich, dreadful, because I've left out all the documents that exonerate his father. There are, of course, no such documents. Nothing exists. And yet we're still in touch. And we continue to exchange correspondence and emails. And most recently, a lengthy exchange on Arnold Schwarzenegger's video statement. And Horst was very upset with him taking out Conan's sword and thought that that was not a good thing, but generally welcomed the Austrian intervention into American affairs.
You've had, I know, you've been inundated with emails from people who have read the book or encountered the material in some other form and have some their own personal story to tell you, or have an additional bit of information to add to the story. So what have you learned for the afterword, for the paperback that you can tell us now?
Well, we've just been debating and we've decided not to put an afterword into the paperback, which comes out in England in April. Maybe for the American paperback will be different, because it's all too fresh and everything's got to be checked. You know, one of the things, maybe because I'm a courtroom lawyer, and you'll know that writing for the New Yorker, because your standards are even higher than courtroom lawyers, you've got to check every fact and everything that comes to you. So I published one piece in the New Yorker, actually, with thanks to you who made the introduction, a couple of weeks ago, a remarkable letter received on Christmas Day from an Austrian historian, a lady in Vienna, who wrote to say that she was the great-granddaughter of a man called Robert Winterstein, who was the prosecutor general, the main federal prosecutor in Austria in 1938, and who was removed from his position by a person unknown because he was Jewish, and was then sent to Buchenwald, where he perished. And the family had the letter removing him from his position and stripping him of his pension rights. But the letter was signed with a signature, but no name. And so they never could work out who had actually removed great-grandfather from his position. And the historian, Maria Theresa Arnbaum, said, only with your book now, she had the German edition, which came out in November, and she'd received as a Christmas present, she found a reference to her great-grandfather, Winterstein, and she learned from the book that it was Otto Wachter who had removed 16,500 people from their positions, including Robert Winterstein, whose signature I confirmed it was on the letter the family had, but didn't know whose name it was. But then she said, I'm not writing to you because of that. I'm writing to you because I live in my great-grandfather's house, and my next door neighbor for 40 years and my dear friend is one of the granddaughters of Otto Wachter. And I now have to break it to her that we are bonded by history in this way. And that was an enormously touching story. There is a sense, you need to understand that the Wächters, there were 6 children and there are 23 grandchildren. And Charlotta's job was to airbrush Otto Wachter out of the history books, which she did pretty much completely successfully. No one knew the Wächter name, but he was a top rank Nazi. If he'd been caught, he would have been at the main Nuremberg trial. And along comes this sort of Brit lawyer, academic, writer who, you know, pulls back the curtain, and the family is, for the most part, not exactly thrilled that the Wächter name is back in the back in the public domain.
How have they shown their displeasure to you, Philippe?
Well, I have to be very careful here because I protect their anonymity, but I have had a series of, it's not that the letters are of displeasures. The letters make suggestions to me, or one, sometimes I've met them and I've had dinner with one, who was actually married, one of the grandsons is married to one of my former students at New York University Law School. And it's a very small world. And the wife, my former student, invited me for dinner. And at the moment that her husband, the grandson of Otto Wachter, left the dining table to go to the men's room, she said, "Could I just ask you something, Philippe?" I said, "Yes, of course, anything at all." She said, this film, this book you're going to do, could you just make sure they're never circulated or published in Austria?" And I said, "No, but why?" And she said, "To protect the children. We must protect the children. You have children. You must understand that it is best to keep this out." So the desire for avoiding scrutiny and stories not told within the family is extremely complex. Another grandson wrote to me, this was last year, the current owner of House Wartenberg, the German language school that Charlotte ran after the war, and where she buried illicitly the body of her husband, having exhumed it illegally from the cemetery in Rome. That grandson wrote to me and said, "Philippe, before your book comes out, could I ask you to, if you could be so good as to publicly forgive my grandfather for what he did to your family, or what you say he did to your family?" And I said, "Well, dear Wächter grandson, no, I won't do that, but I'm all in favor of reconciliation. You have no responsibility for what your grandfather did. Since you are a serious Roman Catholic, and since I now have all these new friends from writing this book, bishops and cardinals in the Vatican, why don't we go together to the Vatican and let's have a conversation with the top team about these kinds of issues?" And I never
Yes,
heard
and
back.
let's let's bring the cameras along too.
Yes.
Of course, the one person in this story who we know was not embarrassed about their Nazi past was Charlotte, who, when the Americans come in after the war, is happy to say, is proud to say to them when they ask her, "Yes, of course I'm a Nazi," right?
Yeah, well, the last phone call that she gets at that point from her husband, the day before the war ends, so like the 8th of May, 1945, this is a hysterical phone call from Otto saying, destroy everything, throw it in the lake at Zell am See." Some of you will have been to idyllic Lake Zell. And then he says, "Well, actually, just throw the public papers, throw the official papers away, but not the private papers," which thankfully that's what we have. So that's how we know this. So he throws all the public papers away. And then, of course, 2 days later, the Americans arrive, and she describes very openly how the Americans turned up, and she wrote about this in her own memoirs. And one of the American army soldiers said, "Are you a Nazi?" And she said, "Yes, yes, I am a Nazi." And the American soldier said, "Well, you're the very first one we've met. And there are no Nazis." She was the only Nazi in Austria, it seems. She was an absolute true believer, deeply anti-Semitic. That emerges in her own diaries as an 18-year-old when she was sent to boarding school in England because she was a troublesome child and her parents thought that what she needed was, a bit of English tutelage at Eastbourne.
Yeah.
She keeps a diary and she describes flirting with a Jew on the train on the way to England. And it goes right till the last moment of the war. She writes this extraordinary letter to Otto in I think it's about April 1945. I've got a brilliant idea. Why don't you tell the Führer that what we should do is we should ally with the English. The English are terrific. They hate the Soviets. They're very nationalistic. And between us, the Austrians, the Germans, and the English, we can defeat the dreaded Soviets, the Bolsheviks. "Ah, no," she said, "of course, I've forgotten. The Jews will spoil it all in England. It's always the fault of the Jews," she writes, "contaminating everything." And that was Charlotte Wächter. So it's hard to feel much empathy for her,
Right.
except, of course, in relation to her love of her husband and what she did for him while he was on the run for 3 years.
Right. Philippe, for you as an English person, a Jewish person, and a descendant of survivors of that period, what has it been like for you to be immersed in this material as completely as you have been for this?
Well, I've been softened
time?
up, I mean, I do cases about mass murder and horrible international crimes and vile violations of human rights, and have done them for 30 years. So I'm used to seeing some pretty horrible things. I had also written, the book that came before, East West Street, which sort of prepared me, which is about my grandfather and what happened to his family. So by the time Otto and Charlotte and Horst come on the scene, I've been prepared. Now, that is not to say there are lots of moments that I found extremely difficult. There's one scene in the film, and I write about it also in the book, where Horst says to me, there's no documents that prove my father's guilt or that indicate my father's guilt. And I spent a long time, I spent 3 years looking for material, and I finally found in an obscure Polish archive in Warsaw, not only photographs of his father over, supervising an act of mass murder, literally present at an act of mass murder and supervising it, but I also found the act of indictment by the United States and the Polish authorities in 1946, and that indicts him for mass murder, and it was accompanied by witness statements and various other things. So Horst took a look at that, and he went, And I said, what do you mean, And he said, well, it's a Polish document, it's a Soviet document, it's a forgery, it's not real. So he always finds a way to skirt around any material that's difficult. The other example that I sometimes mention, because it's so blatant, his father writes a letter to Charlotte in December 1939. He's in Krakow. He's governor of Krakow. He's been doing dreadful things. And he writes home to us, says, darling, it's marvelous. The Vienna Philharmonic has been, lots of famous people coming to salute me and celebrate me and tell me how wonderful I am. And a bit of local difficulty, a bit of Polish trouble. Tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. And this becomes a very notorious act of mass murder, still commemorated today in Poland 75 years later. And Horst's interpretation, he says, Philippe, you see, it says, he writes to my mother, it says, tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. It doesn't say, tomorrow I want to have 50 Poles shot. And so Horst takes refuge in these kinds of interpretations that are troublesome and which irritate me and which occasionally cause me to lose my rag, but generally
as you did a little bit in the film, in the scene in the film where you are showing him the indictment, and it's really the one point at which the emotion that is propelling you through this is exposed.
There have been some very difficult moments. There are moments where Horst bans me from saying his father is a mass murderer in his presence. And of course, there is a whole other difficulty, without giving too much away, which comes towards the end of the book, when his daughter, Horst's daughter, appears, the granddaughter of Otto and Charlotte Wächter, and starts to build up a communication with me, and takes a different direction from her father, and that raises a lot of difficulties.
Right. These two books, East West Street and the Ratline, are very connected, and one follows on from the other. And I hope that everybody who's reading the Ratline will go back and read East West Street if they haven't already. In that book, you talk about the way in which your mother's past was mysterious to you when you were growing up, and your grandfather's past was something that you didn't know about at all. And it also, those stories show how contingent really your family survival was. Tell us something about that history of your own and your own family.
Well, my grandfather was born in Lemberg in 1904, moved to Vienna in 1914, and got married in 1937. My mum was born in July 1938, and then the family, the three of them at various times, moved to Paris. And I was very close to my grandfather. He lived until 1997, but he never talked to me about that period. My brother and I understood that was just a no-go area. And in fact, one of the things that was interesting getting to know Nicholas Frank and Horst Wächter was that they too grew up in a period of silence, that on both sides of the story, there was a silence, the silence of the perpetrator side, the silence of the victim side. And so when this invitation arrived in 2010, I was just curious to know who my grandfather was. I wasn't intending to write a book or do any of this stuff. I was just intending, oh, a message has come in from Stephen saying he's joined the Zoom, but there's no one letting him in. So I'm just going to text him to say he doesn't have been given any ability to join in. So I wonder whether Andrea can, behind the scenes, liaise with Stephen to let him in. I'm just going to say, just sorting out. Someone will find a way. And I leave that to Andrea to sort out while she's offline. While I'll do that. So yes, he can hear because he's just said thanks. I can't even use the chat, unfortunately. I hear you mentioning the issue. Andrea, it's over to you to liaise with Stephen to find a way in, if you can, and we will hope that that happens shortly. But come back with your question.
Yeah, well.
Oh,
I mean,
look, he's appeared.
Oh, here he is.
Hello. I got a little
you've dressed up. You've dressed up for the occasion.
I'm so sorry. I'm shockingly informal. It's so exciting when you have a little note on your screen saying you have been promoted to a panelist. It's very exciting. Anyway, I've been enjoying listening for the last 10 minutes, and I'm sorry I've only joined in now, but I didn't want to interrupt because you were in full flow, Philippe. So carry on.
Well, I'm not going to carry on because we now have you. And I think one of the things that's been interesting, I was saying before I came on, is how you and I became bonded over this at an event at the Hay Festival when I discovered, it reveals my horrific lack of preparation about your own background and your own connection to some of the things that I've written about. And it came, if you recall, at the moment that you told a story about your grandfather, or the gentleman with the revolving doors. And you did it with such brilliant mimicry that I thought, hang on a second, he knows something.
Yes, my grandfather was a Hungarian Jew, and he used to say we were always very special kinds. He said a Hungarian Jew is the only kind of person who can follow you into a revolving door and come out first. He was a terrific figure. But like Philippe, I grew up with this sense of a Jewish family from Eastern Europe who had grown up and found their lives utterly turned over by the horrors of the 1930s and 40s. And all of us with Jewish blood, of course, are likely to have a story of some kind like this. So when I read East Street, West Street, and I thought it so absolutely summed up the feelings that those of us who've been lucky enough to be of a younger generation to have survived have about our ancestors, the ones who actually went through it, and the extraordinary crisscrossing of really important cultural background. That's to say, Philippe's ancestors have had much to do with the settling of law that is so relevant now. I mean, it's extraordinary. Philippe, as you know, is one of the leading human rights lawyers in the world and specializing in crimes against humanity and genocide. And it's that sort of irony that the very people who first came up with the idea of crimes against humanity were amongst those who suffered from the worst examples of it in world history. But it's also a story of survival and family and kinship, and that connects to everybody. You really don't have to be Jewish to read East Street, West Street to feel an extraordinary bond with it. And then subsequently, you get this adventure. I mean, this terrible, comic, horrific adventure of this fleeing Nazi.
and the Ratline. So I mean, it's been a wonderful ride being with Philippe on it. And of course, now that I know him, I'm constantly wanting to pick at his expertise. I mean, just yesterday, 2 days ago, there was a film on television about the Syrian, the gassing of the children in Syria. One of the lawyers there, an American, I think, who was hoping to talk about how we would get to a position where people could be called to account. The footage I saw, I hadn't seen anything so dreadful since the films of the opening of the camps in the 1940s. It was an absolutely terrifying thing to see, and to realize that we had lived through this in the last 10 years without really doing anything about it, without calling Syria or indeed Russia to account. But what was so fascinating was that this gentleman I saw being interviewed was, well, firstly, he said there's never been more evidence that I've ever seen against a world leader guilty of crimes against humanity than against Bashir Assad. And he also said, we will get him. It will happen. Justice will be done. And that's a tremendous thing, this kind of patient sense that things will be put right. I mean, oops, excuse me, there's my phone off there, sorry.
That's probably Mr. Assad looking to silence you.
Yeah.
It's usually what happens. They follow us very closely, these characters.
Yes.
Stephen, you very kindly and incredibly generously started by reading some of the letters and diaries of Otto Wächter, and then we did it together, the audiobook for the Ratline. How did you feel reading those letters from Otto Wächter?
Well, it's a very strange kind of cognitive dissonance, isn't it? Because almost automatically, when you read the story of someone on the run, there's a part of you that is with them, that wants them to get away. You know, you follow them as they cross over the Alps and into Italy and meet up with people who are going to rescue them. And it's just part of human nature that when you're following a narrative like that, you're on the side of the protagonist, we'll say, certainly not hero. But underneath it all is this awful realization that the man was responsible for some quite appallingly dreadful things. And also that he wasn't running because he was ashamed or guilty. He was just running because he was trying to save his skin, really. And all the black comedy of his philandering, his throwing himself into Cinecittà, you know, the growth of Italian cinema.
You should explain, because people don't realize that
so
he needed money.
You're on the run in 40s Italy at a time when cinema, you know, realistic cinema verite is building up, and these, you know, Rome Open City and some of the great movies are being made, and this Nazi war criminal on the run applies to be an extra and actually gets a speaking part in the film. And there he is in Cinecittà, which is the Hollywood of Italy. You imagine him sitting at the commissary with Fellini two tables away. And it's just so strange. And no novelist, what's so beautiful about Ratline, reading it the way Philippe's written it, is Philippe's written it is like a thriller. You can't take your eyes off a single page. But no novelist would dare write the sort of things that reality throw up. This journey he makes, the meetings he has with corrupt and decadent and pro-Nazi Catholic bishops and things who for some bizarre reason have twisted their religion into believing that they should be protecting these genocidal figures. And I mean, it's a sidelight on history, but the beauty of history is it is the sidelights that teach you everything. I remember once reading in a book about the camps, one of the doctors, SS Sturmarzt, only the SS. Everything would say a storm doctor. A doctor of all people should be a Sturmarzt. You know, this Dr. Kramer, I think his name was one of the ones he was writing letters home, which was one of the things that got him, which is why he was caught in the Nuremberg trials. And he he just writes in a casual way on a page about getting a prisoner to make him a signature block. And I remember thinking all the way through this, you arrive at a camp like Auschwitz. He was only there for 3 months, this doctor. He arrived at Auschwitz. He had to sign endless pieces of paper. He was working on behalf of some awful thing which was about analyzing living organs. So he literally was taking livers out of living children and adults to analyze. I mean, just sick. I mean, really, absolutely beyond. But of course, because it was the Holocaust, there was bureaucracy. So he was constantly having to sign his name. So at some point, he presumably said, how do you get a signature block stamp, a signature stamp? And they said, oh, Berlin takes ages to get them. Get one of the prisoners to make one. So he goes and he says, I don't know, who's a good clerk? Who's the good forger? Who's the good handwriter? I'll sign my signature, and who'll cut away the rubber. And anyway, he gets a prisoner to make his signature block. And it isn't the history of the Holocaust. It isn't the history of anything, but it's these kinds of sidelight into history, these weird and farcical details. What I suppose
it's always the detail. It's always the detail.
It's part of what Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil. These details, and Philippe is a master of this kind of detail.
You have to stop being you have to stop being so complimentary, because my beloved Auntie Ita is watching this in Totnet.
Hello, Auntie Ita.
And
Hello,
she
I'm
knows
Stephen.
the truth, and you can't be so complimentary and so nice.
No man is a hero to his aunt.
I just want to interrupt you both to ask, to remind our viewers that if you have a question, we have a few minutes left, and you can write and email a question to reservations@writersblockpresents.com. So if you want to quickly type, there should be time for a couple of questions. And I can't resist asking Stephen, hello Stephen, I'm
Hello,
Rebecca.
Rebecca.
I can't resist asking you, if there is a movie of the film, who?
Well,
he brushes his hair back, hoping to look like Otto Wachter.
I was pulling back my lockdown hair, but I think, but there's no question I'm too old and not glamorous enough to play Otto Wachter. He wasn't quite up there with, Heydrich in terms of the sort of lion-maned Aryan look. I have a feeling, and it's the way I get cast, it would be the decadent and dissipated bishop, the Nazi-loving bishop, who I suspect.
That was what I wanted you to say. So.
Good.
Great. Andrea, do you have any questions for Philippe or for Stephen from our viewers? Yeah.
Yes. Hi there. Wait, can you hear me? Okay, Stephen, it's lovely to meet you and to see you. We have gotten some questions in. Let's see, for Philippe, between East-West Street and the Ratline, do you think these two books are more personally or more intellectually satisfying for you?
I think the contribution of East-West Street in an intellectual sense will resonate more widely, because it goes back to the way in which these two concepts, crimes against humanity and genocide, were invented, which people were really not aware of, how these two characters, Lauterpacht and Lemkin, invented them. And I think that is intellectually a significant story. And I don't think Ratline has that heft, but I think, frankly, Ratline will sell even more copies, because whilst people have a certain interest in international law, they're actually even more interested in daily life on the top table, Nazi existence. And that is, I think, not so much an intellectual contribution, but almost a prurient contribution. You just can't believe how these people lived.
I love the Charlotte stuff. I can't get enough of it. I think we need another book on Charlotte. I mean,
Well, actually, it's interesting you say that, because for me, Charlotte is the beating heart of the story. She's the glue who holds the whole family together. She's the link between the father and the son. And my wonderful editor, Vicky Wilson, who's an absolutely brilliant editor, at a certain point did express the view that perhaps there was too much Charlotte. And I said, no, there's not enough. We want more.
With her she walks out of the manor house that she's now occupying with the tea set that belonged to the original Jewish owners. Is now something.
I mean, she's not only a plunderer, but she's an exhumer of dead bodies. I mean, you have to admire. It's very difficult not to admire the love of a wife who digs up her own husband, not just once, but 4 times, and carries him on each occasion to her new residence so that she can be close to her beloved. And I kid you not, that is what happened. Now, that sounds a bit sicko, but if you want love, that is an expression of love. Stephen's looking a little mortified.
No, it's true. It is absolutely right. I mean, you can sort of say that there are two ways that humans expend all their energy and their self, and some, without trying to be gender specific, that men do it through countries and corporations and firms and things exterior to themselves that they build up and identify with, and women do it with family and children. But there is, in this case, certainly this Otto in that sense was impractical. He was all about show and officialdom and doing a job, but he held no sense of holding together what he and his family was. Charlotte was all about that. Everything was about connecting the family, keeping it together, which is a primal instinctive urge that you cannot but admire. But she was, of course, if we'd met her, if any of us were in a room with her, we would have found her a monster. We would have hated her assumptions and her grandeur and her snobberies and her absolute complete.
Well, you say that, Stephen, but I have had a welter of letters from people who in their late teens or early 20s were pupils at House of Wartenberg, which was the German language school. And there was one in particular from Cornwall, a retired major general, who assured me that I'd got Charlotte completely wrong, that she was a wonderful lady, extremely generous, and that I had completely misunderstood the husband, who he had been assured by Charlotte was just a minor official in some faraway place who was killed during the war. Okay,
so here's an interesting one. While Charlotte was a true believer, how much of a true believer was Otto really?
He was a total true believer. I mean, you get through, the Sun gives you 10,000 pages of documents, and I again pay deep gratitude to the extraordinary research students I had who helped me work my way through this. But you find these extraordinary nuggets. So one, summer of 1941, and Otto's father, General Joseph von Wachter, former Minister of Defense, former, the Kaiser's, the Emperor's general in Galicia, writes to his son, "My darling son, I have a problem. Could you assist me? A very dear friend of mine has married a Jew, and they have produced a child. And that child now resides in your district, in Krakow. Could you?" And that child has now been caught up in the race laws and the protections against the Jews. Could you intercede and just for me, help her? He writes back and he says, "Darling Papa, yes, I've looked into it. I've had 2 or 3 people look into it. They've produced files, and I'm sending you here the dossier. It is completely true what you say. She has indeed been caught up, but, darling Papa, the law is the law, and we have to protect ourselves from these people. And the only way we can do that is with these laws." So, faced with a personal request from the most important man in his life, his beloved father, he basically tells him to bugger off. The laws are there to protect us from this kind of pollutant.
There is, I mean, one can overstate it, and I'm just not an expert, but it's often forgotten quite how different things were in Austria as opposed to Germany because of the history of that country. We're used to the idea that individual nation states want to be independent. So the idea of a nation state, a huge and powerful one, wanting to be submerged into a greater Germany is perhaps alien to us, because we think of removing ourselves and devolving. But Bismarck's refusal to allow Germany to accept Austria, refusal to allow Austria to be part of, all the others could be, all the Bavarians and Franconians and all the others could all be part of this new country, Germany, which was in the lifetime of many of the people there, was Germany becoming no longer Thuringia and Swabia and Westphalia and all these different things, different kingdoms, becoming one solid country. And Austria, the German Austrians, felt out of it. They were connected with Magyars and Serbs, and that they were second-class Germans. And so Hitler himself, an Austrian, annexing Austria, the Austrians who then came forward as Nazis and Gauleiters seemed even more passionate to play their part in the Nazi story than many of the Germans. Is that I think that's part of the psychology of Austria.
Absolutely. And of course, if you go into the post-war period when Charlotte is, working her magic and scrubbing her beloved husband out of the history books, Austria at that point, thanks to Winston Churchill, who was the first to use it, they're the first victims of Hitlerism. And for 2 generations of Austrians, they live in this impression that they've been on the receiving end, they're not participants. And yet, if you look at the front bench of the famous Nuremberg trial, there's quite a few Austrians sitting there, including Horst Wächter's godfather, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was the governor of Nazi-occupied Holland for 5 years and is today the most hated man in Holland. And I didn't understand why the Dutch publisher wanted this book to come out at the same moment that it came out in England, not the English edition. And it was a bestseller in Dutch because Horst sleeps with a photograph of his beloved godfather, Arthur, next to him still today, in the belief that this was a good Austrian. So you're absolutely right. The Austrian dimension, and coming back to the earlier point of our conversation, Nicholas, who despises his father, and Horst, who seeks to adore his, one is a German and one is an Austrian, and it plays into these impressions that you're articulating and that I feel also. And I don't know about you, Stephen. I mean, for me, it's being in Germany is different from being in Austria.
No question. No question. Austria it was that peculiar thing. It had the victim status after the war, so characters like Kurt Waldheim could somehow get away with being international jurists and hugely respected figures. And it only later did people say, "Well, hang on, that's a bit strange." It's got Mozart, it's got the Konditorei with a K, it's got its Sachertorte and its Sound of Music, and it's got a sort of iconography of innocence and charm and splendor. But underneath it all, it was both in the past when Hitler was growing up in Linz and then in Vienna, there were over 100 anti-Semitic magazines in Vienna alone in the 1890s and 1900s. It was a boiling point of anti-Semitism and thewlism and all these isms and Spartacism, an immense number of them, all of them. And it's a very different thing. Germany has I mean, of course, it's the same language, but Germans don't feel that they're Austrian, and there's an uneasy relationship, isn't there?
Here's one. From East-West Street, we learned to differentiate between crimes against individuals and crimes against humanity vis-a-vis World War II. How has your additional experience researching the Ratline changed your legal perspective in terms of human rights and genocide?
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. I mean, the two concepts, crimes against humanity and genocide, reflect respectively the protection of the individual and the protection of the group. The idea of crimes against humanity is that we are all, as human beings, holders of basic rights and entitled to protections, and we must be protected because we are individual human beings. The founder of the concept of genocide took a different view, Raphael Lemkin. He said, look, people get subject to really nasty stuff not because they've done anything, but because they're a member of a group that's hated at a moment in time or place. And so we must protect the group. And to protect the group is to protect the individual. And over time, both concepts were invented in the summer of 45, so very recent inventions. And over time, and this is complex, genocide has risen to the top of the pile. It's seen as the crime of crimes. If an American president, Donald Trump, a few weeks ago, says the Chinese are committing a genocide against the Uyghurs, it's reported on the front pages of all the newspapers. But if he had said it's only a crime against humanity or it's war crimes or whatever, no one will pay any attention. Everyone wants it to be the worst of the worst.
The big G.
Yeah, the big G. And we're falling into this trap of somehow imagining that the killing of hundreds of thousands of people as a crime against humanity is less bad than a genocide. I can give you a very simple example. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia characterized the murder of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men at Srebrenica as a genocide. And that is marked around the world as one of the terrible post-Second World War crimes, which it is. But who remembers the killings of 3 million people at around the same time in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which are either a crime against humanity or a war crime? And no one. And so what is it in this system that we've created that somehow elevates certain categories of people to sort of reification and recognition and commemoration, but others, simply because we haven't called it a genocide, are forgotten? And we've got this right now with the Uyghurs. I get about 3 requests a day. Is what's going on in China a genocide? And I say, look, I don't know if it's a genocide. I don't have the facts. I read what you know. I can see what's in the papers, but I don't know what's going on in these camps. To prove a genocide, you have to prove an intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. If that's what the Chinese are doing and it can be proven, it's genocide. But actually, who cares what label you put on it? They're doing nasty, terrible things. It is undoubtedly a crime against humanity, and it is not less bad. So I have become troubled by the way labels somehow are used to indicate the hierarchy of horrors. And I think we have to look and keep our mind on the bigger picture. What's happening to the Uyghurs, what's happening to the Rohingya, whatever label you put on it, whatever you call it, what's the story you told, Stephen, of what's going on in Syria, also probably not a genocide in that narrow legal term, but certainly war crimes, certainly crimes against humanity. We've got to move away. But what it teaches us, and Rebecca and Stephen and I are joined in this, is the sheer power of words. Genocide evokes something that the technical term crime against humanity just can't. And Lemkin's genius was to have invented this word. And it inspires in our imaginations the horror. We see horror with that word. So words are important, but they mustn't deflect us from the bigger picture.
Superb.
Rebecca, any last questions from you? Because words are important.
Yeah, words are
Nobody
very
does it
important.
better
Well,
than you.
I would just ask, Philippe, this book is about a son grappling with his father's legacy, and your writing of it is a grandson grappling with a grandfather's legacy. And I just wonder if you could say anything about what happens with the next generation, the generation of your children and perhaps your graduate students who are working on this material. does it mean the same thing to them? And what are they making of it, do you think?
I mean, look, Stephen, I'd be curious to know when you really came to this. I mean, I knew a bit about things that had happened, or even quite a lot, but I didn't ask questions, and I had a life to get on with. And in your 20s and in your 30s, you're busy with the really important things in life, finding people to love, finding people to eat with, finding work to do, and you don't want to be distracted. And then you arrive at a certain point and life has settled in a certain way, and you start asking yourself questions. And for me, it happened when I was 50. I mean, so I think it plays a role, as it does also for Magdalena Wächter, Horst's daughter, who has now become, in her 40s, deeply embroiled in this story, but only in her 40s. And I just wonder, Stephen, how it was for you. At what point did you start asking questions? And
I remember when I was 10 years old, and there was a photograph I discovered rooting through some drawers, and I said to my mother, who are these people? And she sat me down and said, many of them were, though a lot of them were children, and she said, that was your grandfather's sister, and that's your grandfather's brother, and that's his, you know, these are these other, their children, his nephews and nieces. And I said, oh, well, where do they live? And she said, well, they're all dead, I'm afraid. And I said, oh, how's that? And she said, Hitler killed them. And so I actually pictured Hitler, the figure with the moustache that I knew from newsreels or whatever, with a knife, personally killing them. And so you have this kind of rather sort of demonic and absolute view of Hitler. And then, of course, almost every member of my family who was a witness to Europe had died by the time I was interested. That's the really frustrating thing. When you're young, you don't ask questions like that. And of course, an old grandfather doesn't want to tell his grandson about Auschwitz, for heaven's sake. How could he want to? He just, you know, wants him to be happy and free in a free country, and to forget all that and put it behind them. You know, the only thing he would occasionally do is say, I still can't eat brown bread. It's poor people's bread. I want white bread. And he couldn't understand how we thought brown bread was really good. That was the sort of one little reference, you know, brown bread when I was young was poverty. It was terrible. We dreamt of white bread. And, you know, but actual talking of what it was like, it would be brushed away. I think I became interested because, well, you know, naturally one wants to know more about one's family as you get older. And as you say, about the age of 50, these things, suddenly you connect with the kind of people that your grandparents were, because you know what it's like to be that age. The thing that most interests me, though, is that awful as the legacy of a Jewish person is, many of whose family have been wiped out and whom we'll never meet, and many of whose ancestors, whose, you know, grandparents' generation suffered monstrous indignity and humiliation and theft and insult, both physical and mental, and the most appalling lives that we can't imagine. None of that was their choice. None of that, they were victims, and you could almost say they were just like, you know, cows being herded or sheep being taken to slaughter or whatever, or to be sheared. There's no moral decision. So in terms of storytelling, the interesting ones are the ones who had a choice, the ones who could have escaped but didn't. For example, that's one type. The ones like Winter or obviously Schindler, you know, who decided to do something. And then there are those from the regime itself, and they had to live with their actions being why they are a subject of the history of the Holocaust. Whereas, you know, the Jewish people who were killed, they, you know, you arrive, maybe there's the decision, do I become a capo and survive an extra year or two in the camp while, you know, basically helping it, or do I just submit to my death? But there's no choice. And of course, that's why films are things like Schindler's List. There is no real film about somebody just being taken, put on a train and killed, because there's no action, there's no moral choice, there's no dilemma, and stories require that. And so, and we learn more by trying to understand the wicked than we do by trying to understand the victim, because there's nothing to understand in a victim. If you are just simply plucked and killed. Whereas if you're a plucker and a killer, what makes you that? And that's an endless question that we still can't really come anywhere close to.
It's interesting that you say that, because the book opens with a quotation from a wonderful Spanish writer. I don't know, Rebecca or Stephen, whether you've either read him, Javier Cercas.
Oh, right.
Start with Soldiers of Salamis, one of the finest books I've ever read. And if you remember, because I'm a courtroom lawyer and I like to go to the scenes where my cases take place, it's the same thing with this. I've got to go and see everything. If Wächter walked across the Dolomites, I've got to walk across the Dolomites. If Wächter died in the Santo Spiritu Hospital, Sala Baglivi, 150 meters long, I need to get in there and I need to see it for myself. I want to look at the beams he last saw before he died. And I couldn't get in. For 4 years, I couldn't get in. It's a Vatican-run hospital. And then I came to know, actually through East-West Street, this incredible Spanish writer, Javier Cercas. And I mentioned to him, I said, you know, any ideas, any connections in Rome? He said, no. Then one day he sends me an email and he says, I've been invited by the Pope to give a lecture on faith and literature. I'm going to the Vatican. And I said, oh, well, if you meet anyone who might get me access to the Santo Spiritu Hospital, put a word in, you know, big me up. So he goes off to Rome and he gives his lecture on faith and literature, even though he's not a believer, but his mother is, and she's thrilled that he's been invited. And there's then a cocktail reception, and he comes across a cardinal, a Portuguese cardinal and an Irish bishop. And he starts talking about the Ratline, the podcast, and the Irish bishop, who I've become quite good mates with now, says to Cercas, Philippe Sands, did you say Philippe Sands? And Javier says, yes, I did. He said, I think I know him. He made that podcast on the BBC about the Ratline, not very complimentary about the Vatican, but I loved it. And I'd love to meet him. So Javier, I literally went to Rome the next day, and the bishop and the cardinal got us a private entrance to the Sistine Chapel, which was fantastic. Just the two of us in the Sistine Chapel. And we're sitting there in the Sistine Chapel, and I turn to Javier and I say, this is before we go to the hospital. And I say, why are you so interested? Why are you helping me? Why are you being so lovely? And it's, you know, and he just looks at me and he says, because Philippe, it's more important to understand the perpetrator than the victim. And it's a variation of what you're saying, Stephen. But interestingly, I've had quite a few emails or letters of complaint about that quotation because it's interpreted
as sympathy.
Not as sympathy, but as a saying that somehow what happened to the victims isn't important, which of course is not my position at all. But I think Javier is basically right, because ultimately what connects us all is the desire to find a way to stop these kinds of things from happening. The law is one means, education is another. And if we're going to stop making it happen, we don't look to the victims. We look to those who do these acts. We look to understand why Otto Wachter did what he did and why his wife was so darn complicit in egging him on, bigging him up, getting him to do it. And that's why I think Javier Cercas is right. And we need to look in that direction a lot more.
Agreed.
Well, this seems like the perfect place to tell people to read the Ratline, because it's unputdownable. It's unimaginably, I mean, it's just compulsively fabulous. I couldn't stop reading it. And I thank you. I thank all of you, Stephen, Philippe, and Rebecca, for participating today and for working with Writer's Block and the Beverly Hills Bar Association. Enormously grateful for that.
And do we all get to become honorary members of the Beverly Hills Bar Association, which we are all desperate? Stephen, who's not a million miles from Beverly Hills right now, he's always wanted to be a lawyer. I know that. He won't say that.
Well, Zan Rufus Isaacs, who's not on screen right now, I'm sure that they'll welcome you, with open arms, all of us, to the Beverly Hills Bar
Meet at the Polo Bar is the bar, the bar that I associate with Beverly Hills.
So thank you. This will be available on our YouTube channel soon, we'll hand it over to the Beverly Hills Bar Association so they can have fun with it as well. And we'll see you soon. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you, Stephen. And biggest
Wonderful.
Thanks of all, Rebecca, for all the preparation and the wonderful, wonderful questioning. Thank you so much to Writer's Block.
Thank you.
Big love to Aunt Ita.
And big love to Aunt Ita, who's probably nodded off by now, Stephen. She's
Okay.
probably nodded off.
I have that power over women.
Bye-bye.